Alright, it's Modumate time. Today, we'll be modeling a shed together that looks something like this. We're going to model its massing graph, its separators, host them into the scene, add some finishes and attachments, add the terrain, and create some 3D images. All in one training. It's going to be kind of a soup to nuts training, and we'll move at a pretty fast pace so you learn a lot. Let's get into it. Alright, so we're here in a blank canvas. We're going to model a shed together. We're going to do that using the line and rectangle tools of the massing graph. The hotkeys are LI and RE, so as I won't click these buttons again, I'll be using the hotkeys. I'm orbiting, panning, and zooming around the scene by right-clicking in the scene and moving my mouse to orbit, middle-clicking in the scene and move my mouse to pan, and scrolling my wheel to zoom. And here I am now clicking a line in the scene. I'm mousing around and I'm seeing some affordances about the direction. Red, green, and blue are three axial aligned directions. I also see the length there shown in 7 foot 2, 7 foot 10, 8 foot 2. I'm going to type a 9 foot by 12 foot shed. I'm going to actually turn my camera a little higher up here. I'm going to hold shift when I see this red axis to force my constraint to it. Mouse over to the start point, which gives me the ability to align to that start point, and then click on it. And then as I click and click, I've completed my floor plate. This shed's so simple. It's going to be a rectangle with a door and a window. So this is absolutely the right soup to nuts starter presentation if you're really new to 3D, or if you're new to Modumate and want to kind of see the ideas just presented in a simple form. So the second tool, the rectangle, is a 1-click, 2-click, 3-click process. I like to go vertically with my wall planes, so when I draw multiple planes in a row, they all have the same height. Here I'll go 8 feet up, for example, and then I'll come across and I'll click, click, click. Great, and I've laid out the planes of the walls using 4 rectangles in a chain. I press escape to finish chaining rectangle planes. I press escape again to leave the rectangle tool. I'm going to go back to my line tool now, and I'll draw a sloped roof for this thing. Let's call a 6 to 12 slope, where the width is 4 foot 6, therefore the height should be 2 foot 3. In fact, I just managed to eyeball 2 foot 3. So I'm going to click, 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 and click, press escape, switch to my rectangle tool, RE, and then I'm going to use a second behavior of the rectangle tool where I could click corner, corner, corner. Great, but I'm actually a bigger fan of extruding rectangles when I see one that can be extruded, and to do that all the rectangle tool has to do is click somewhere along the length of a line, such as here. When I click here, it takes the start and end points of that line as my first 2 clicks, and then lets me just extrude over to another snap, where when I snap here or here, it happens to, or if I hover over the green axis from my start point, hold shift and hover to either point, I'm guaranteed to get the right plane. And I turn around my camera, I see this last triangle's not been created, so I'll use my line tool, LI, and I will trace any one edge of this missing triangle. And when I do, I have now completed a face here. But since I think the same studs will be used to frame this entire wall, I'm actually going to just remove that line there. I'm going to remove this line and this line. I have a simple little pentagonal prism, which is going to be my shed one day. Next, I'm going to add some overhangs. Back to the line tool, LI. Drawing a line that is aligned to a sloped or non-axial aligned line, so many lines, is a simple process of tracing 2 points that are not aligned to red, green, or blue. When I click here and then click here, I end up seeing a new set of affordances that help me draw along the same line I just set up. And we see it broken down into its component red and blue axes here. So I'm going to go, let's say 1.5 feet of overhang. And then I'll go along the world green axis back to the other end of the building, come up, very nice. Do the same thing over here, 1.5 feet. And you could type 1 foot 6, you could type 1-6, 1 space 6, 1 apostrophe 6, quote. It's all up to you. We interpret all sorts of different typing patterns. Now here, these overhangs on the front and back of the building, I think would be best done by a rectangle. I'm going to go RE for rectangle, click in the corner here, come out 1 foot. How about 1 foot? And then draw up to the top point, down to the opposite point. Do the same thing on the other side. Actually, for diversity's sake, I'm going to grab these 2 planes. I'm going to use the move tool and copy them to the back side of the building. Hotkey MV for move, also found here under the select tools. I will click this corner and I will press the control key to turn it from a move into a copy. So copying things is actually a behavior of the move tool once you press the control key. Next, I will delete these two lines here, and it's going to help me. Oh, perfect. Yes, I've now united all of the surface area outside the building into one big overhang plane, so our roof assembly can just live there. Next, I'm going to draw the doors and windows. Again, with the line tool, I'm going to go here. Let's go 1 foot over, and then up 80 inches. And I could come over 3 feet, and I'll come down. I'll hold Shift to actually align to the vertical axis, and mouse over here to hit the ground. Then I'll come over 1 more foot. I'm going to lay out a sill height for my window of 32 inches, and then come across 3 feet, and come up 4 feet, which coincidentally I've already master planned to be the same height as my door. So I'll come across here again, hold Shift and match the start point of my window, click again. I've now completed my window. I'll delete this kind of reference content that helped me lay it out, and I've got the massing graph of my shed now laid out, and that's what? That's like 3 minutes? 5 minutes, I guess. I think just for completeness' sake, I'm actually going to add a foundation stem wall to this building, even though most sheds don't need it. I'm gonna imagine this is a concrete pad, and it also probably wants a little stoop. So I'm gonna go 4 feet out by 5 feet wide, just to make sure the door is swinging on a big old stoop. Some sheds can just swing over terrain, but just in case we wanted to stoop, there it is. And then I'll use the rectangle tool to lay out a stem wall. Let's imagine it's 2 feet deep, maybe 2.5 feet deep. 2.5 feet is the vertical height of my rectangle. And then I'll come around the corners and hit the 4 corners of my building. And I've now laid out the stem wall. And just in case, the pattern I'm showing here is something that you, the viewer, are likely to use in your building designs. That's the reason I'm giving it an unnecessarily large foundation. But this next plane I'm drawing here is the spread footing. So I'm thinking there's going to be an 8-inch thick spread footing represented by this 8-inch deep plane. So I've now added some planes for the below grade planes here. And if I were to just think out loud about the height of this building above grade, I think that the actual top of the walking surface might want to be 3 or 4 inches above grade, just so that there's a bit of the soil meets the building at its foundation instead of at its studs. So I'm going to grab the building, I'm going to use the move tool, MV, and I'm going to move it 4 inches above grade. Very cool. That's going to help me out when I lay out my terrain later. But right now the outcome is that technically the floor plate is a little bit above where we can see from the axes the world ground plane is found. But this is the end of the massing graph. Pretty simple building here today. Next we're going to start putting some walls, floors, doors, and windows and roofs on it. So let's go into our BIM tools and jump into the wall tool, for example. I think this building deserves a pretty simple 2x4 exterior wall, and let's imagine this 9x12 shed could be used as a little office, perhaps. It could just be a storage shed, in which case maybe you don't need gypsum interiors. But if you want this to be maybe like a little backyard office or a yoga room or something like that, a small little ADU, not a full ADU, you couldn't live in this, but a backyard accessory room. We're going to want to frame the inside of that. I'm going to choose an out-of-the-box wall called the 2x4 exterior wood stud wall. And when I click the 3 dots here, we see we can duplicate this preset to call it the I'm going to actually double click then into this recipe. We have a new wall in the universe. We're going to call this shed exterior wall. And it has a few layers to it. This UI here is called the BIM designer. You can navigate it by pressing your middle mouse wheel in and moving your mouse to pan and scrolling to zoom. We see 4 layers, some interior gypsum, some 2x4s, some OSB, and some waterproofing. Now, let's see. I want to make some changes here. I want gypsum boards that are 1/2 inch. I'm pretty sure we already have that layer in Modumate, so I'm going to click Swap Preset, which brings up a list of all the alternative layers in Modumate. When I search gypsum, just the word gyp for example, 1/32 of an inch of gypsum looks like maybe it's going to be used in some kind of paint layer or some kind of like powder. We're looking for 1/2 inch gypsum boards, so bingo, this is the layer we want. Now these 2x4s look mostly good, but they are not spaced correctly. So let's make a change to the definition of this layer. To do that, I personally advocate for duplicating the preset because we don't know where else that preset was being used in other assemblies in a valid way, which if we made changes to it could invalidate that, for example, roof assembly or ceiling. Some ceilings are spaced at 24 inches on center. So we make a new layer here, duplicate that recipe. This is now a fresh recipe that's used nowhere else in the universe, and I'm just going to call this shed exterior studs. And then here, this typical 2x4 is a good module, but the pattern is wrong. So we'll click swap on this pattern item, which brings up a list of alternative patterns here, like 16 inches on center. Click the check mark, and we now have a pattern that, although you can't see studs today, we are working on that coming out in less than 12 months, probably next spring. The pattern is used in the quantity estimation process, so we're tracking the right amount of studs. 2x4 is the right material here. And then I think I could choose a different insulation between studs. If this were just a shed, no insulation needed. If we wanted to actually kind of spend an office workday in this shed, then we probably should swap to some kind of insulation. I think fiberglass bats are a common thing to put between some studs. So now we've picked the right material. This stud layer looks complete to me. Next, we've got the exterior sheathing. I'm thinking instead of OSB, I want some plywood. So I'm gonna click swap on this layer. I'm gonna search plywood in the layer alternates. I see 4 types of plywood already found. I see 15, 30 seconds, almost a half an inch. That seems pretty good to me. And when I click check mark, I end up putting it in the place where the OSB used to be. We can see it here in the thumbnail that plywood has now been put outside the studs. And lastly, this waterproofing here. I think that this waterproofing is maybe a little thick for my needs, so I'm going to duplicate it. I now have a fresh waterproofing layer. I'm going to call this shed waterproofing. And I'm going to change the thickness to 1/32 of an inch. And that's the only thing I want to change about it. I think the dark gray, shiny material is kind of it's fine to me. This wall is ready for use in the scene. All right, now when I click on different walls, we're going to see here that the planes are proposing to add a wall to them. But I see gypsum on the outside. What's going on? I think what's going on here is that the planes of my massing graph are inside out. So instead of flipping this assembly, what I'm going to do is press escape, leave the wall tool, and address the direction of my graph. So this is after I modeled my massing graph. It might have been a best practice for me to go and make sure all the planes are facing the right way before I crafted my wall. But I skipped that step. It came back to bite me. I'm going to do it now. The way that I do it is by turning on the graph direction switch here in the camera properties, which turns on a whole bunch of arrows showing you the direction that things go in the massing graph. Edges in the massing graph have a start and end. Faces in the massing graph have a front and back. And that's how our walls make sense of which direction to put, for example, the exterior waterproofing. These planes are all facing inside right now, though. They don't have an arrow pointing out. So what I'm going to do is grab these planes by holding Shift and clicking on all of them, and then pressing the F key. Alternatively, I could have pressed this flip button here, and when I do, it brings all the arrows to face outside. In fact, these same planes down here need to face out as well. It probably had to do with the fact that I wound around this building in a counterclockwise order. If I had laid out these planes in a clockwise order, let's see what happened. If I lay out the foundation and I go around the building clockwise, yeah, look at that. My planes would have been facing out. So I went around the building the wrong direction, and at the time that I was doing it, Modumate couldn't tell that I would eventually have this be the outside face. So we are working on the planes becoming a little bit smarter, but for now, flipping and make sure your massing graph is facing outward is key to getting your walls to behave correctly. With that said, I can now go back to my wall tool. Hotkey is WA. So when I leave the wall tool by pressing escape and press WA, I am back into the wall tool. I can click this shed exterior wall, hover over the planes, click, 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 and I've now got all of my above grade exterior walls. The foundation there, I think I want some kind of cast-in-place concrete assembly, so I'm going to go to the 6-inch cast-in-place concrete wall, and let's try to use that for our stem wall. I'm going to duplicate the preset, then jump down into that duplicate by double-clicking, and change this to shed stem wall, which is kind of a walking contradiction. Most sheds don't need stem walls, but I'm modeling it just in case you want to refer to this kind of technique when you build bigger buildings. Here I've got the right thickness for my needs, but if I wanted to make a thicker wall, I would just duplicate my preset and change the thickness in that duplicate, as well as changing its name. Here though, the properties are all fine to me. What I do want to do is add the waterproofing that can extend a little bit down into the below grade situation. So I'm going to go add a second layer, and we see now that there are 2 layers to this assembly. I will click the swap icon here, and I'm going to search the word shed. And because I've been using the word shed in my custom layers, I now can see some of the custom layers I've made, like the waterproofing. When I click checkmark here, and we get this waterproofing layer, it is the very same recipe as was used in our above grade wall. So in the quantity takeoffs, there will be 1 line item for the total area of waterproofing, and it will break down the subtotals of how much was used in studs, how much was used on concrete. Very cool. I think our foundation wall is ready to roll. I'm going to go hover down here, and oh, I'm equipping the wrong wall, so I will go click this stem wall here, and when I click, it looks like there was a slight issue with our preview there. So I'm just, when I click, it turns out that it's actually the wall that I expected. I've now added this concrete stem wall. It's a little wider than the framed wall. We're going to be talking about offsets of how we make these walls align in just a moment. But finally, the foundation, the spread footing, I'm going to imagine that's also cast in place concrete, and it's quite a bit wider, perhaps 16 inches wide. I don't know. So for that, I'm going to duplicate the same starting assembly. I'm going to jump into this one. I'm going to call it shed spread footing. And I'm going to duplicate this layer here that's no longer the right width for my needs. I'm going to call this shed spread footing layer. Change the thickness to 16 inches. And look at that, it became super thick. I don't think it needs waterproofing per se on its sides, so I'm going to just go back to the project and use this assembly. And then click and click and click and click, and we've got ourselves all the walls in the project. So the next step is going to be adding some floors. To see all the floors of the project, I can either select and hide my roof by turning my camera horizontal, dragging a selection window across my roof, typing HI to hide it, and then all the elements fully enclosed by my selection get hidden so I can see the floor plates. I'll go to my floor plane here, my floor tool, and I see a 6-inch cast-in-place concrete slab. That seems good. I could have used a 5-inch, I think, but I'll use 6-inch just for efficiency purposes. And here we have now the assemblies that are, when I hover over these planes, we see that the assembly is halfway up and halfway down on its plane. We had the same phenomenon happening in the walls, but with the wall, I decided to defer the topic. With floors, though, it's very clear. When I drew my massing graph, I intended the floor to hang below the horizontal planes. So I'm going to press a hotkey on my keyboard, the letter S. S represents the letter down. W, when pressed, nudges an assembly up. And as we'll find in the walls, there's also the keys A and D that nudge left and right, respectively. So that W, A, S, D are like 4 directions you can nudge assemblies by pushing them up, down, left, and right from their the planes on which they host. So here I've hung this assembly below its plane. I'm going to click, and I can now confidently expect my floor plates are below the planes. And now those 2 planes are taken care of. Let's quickly go into our door and window tools and grab the right doors and windows for our needs. Here I'm going to go over to my door tool. I'm going to go grab one of my swing doors. Kind of here in the middle we have some out-of-the-box swing doors. I'll click on the paneled swing door ash and hover over the planes. We can see here that any plane can host a door. Really, it makes sense to just host it where it belongs. And here, this same assembly has the ability to nudge in and out, but it seems like a pretty good fit where it currently lives. If we didn't like where it lived, again, we could use S to nudge down on screen, W nudges up on screen, A nudges left on screen, D nudges right on screen. And the property being modified by this is the offset, centered, negative, or positive. When I make these changes with A, for example, it changes to a positive offset, outward in the direction of the arrow. And centered and negative mean centered on the plane and behind the arrow, respectively. Centered seems pretty good for where it is right now, but I expect as we get a final place for our wall, we'll want to move this door too. Lastly, let's go to a window. We've got here a window. I'm going to grab a hung window just because I like the idea of there being 2 sashes here. So I'll hover over this plane and click. And again, we have quickly placed a window into the scene. It can also nudge in and out. We'll address that in just a moment. Alright, finally, I will unhide the roof and we'll get some assemblies on this roof. So I modeled an 8-foot tall plane here, which I kind of want to be the clear space inside the assembly. So I think my roofs will justify upward on the plane. And the roof I will use is going to be a fairly simple one. This 2x8 insulated wood joist here seems like a pretty good fit. If I double click into this, let's see what it's made of. It's got 2x8s at 16 inches. It's got 3/4 inch plywood on the top, and it's got waterproofing on top. Seems like a good fit, but what I will do is I'm going to actually duplicate this preset, call it shed roof, which I realize is actually a roof design typology that this is not. This is a gable roof, but this is a roof for a shed. It's going to be called shed roof. And then this waterproofing here is not the same preset as my walls have. So I'm going to click swap on this and type shed, and we see here shed waterproofing. I've now put that same layer here as in the rest. So I've done my due diligence of linking my layers together. I'm ready to now rock and roll with this shed roof. I'm hovering in the scene. I see it's centered on its plane right now, but if I press the W key, it jumps upward, and I can jump onto these 4 planes and host a roof that is upward of its planes. So we've now turned the whole massing graph into some construction assemblies. I do think it's worth kind of showing you the way to switch between view modes. If you want to see the massing graph, you can click this icon down here. These view modes help switch between different views of your model, and especially what we've worked on so far is the massing graph and the separators. So the first 2 buttons, switch between them. If you have a Windows keyboard, then you can press F1 and F2 to switch between these rapidly. If you ever want to change the sculpture of the building, you can grab these elements and use the move tool, and you can change the size of your massing graph, which, as you can see it both in the black and white view as well as the hosted separators view, doing something like this. Or maybe if you wanted to resize the roof, you grab the whole roof, raise the roof. All right, that's a silly shed. I will press click, I will press escape, and I'll press Control Z to bring it back down. Control Z undoes actions, Control Y redoes actions. This massing graph is pretty much, it's close to finished, but what we have not done yet is decide that 9 foot by 12 foot nominal size we modeled the shed as being, what does that mean to us in terms of the construction? I meant for it to represent the exterior face of studs. So I'm actually going to take the time now to nudge these walls into a position that the exterior face of stud is aligned to my massing plane, so that from outside face of stud to outside face of stud, there will be a 9 foot space, and likewise 12 feet from front to back. To do this, I'm going to use a tool called a cut plane. This tool is one of the bread and butter ways to see Modumate's details. The way that you use it is that you click on the cut plane tool, click a place for the cut plane to pass through, a direction for it to look, in this case I'll cut by looking down the building, and it ends up cutting you a little view of the building. You press escape to select this cut plane and turn on its culling, and it will hide it will kind of cut the model like a dollhouse. Often very useful for viewing plans. In this case, we're looking at a section. And we can see here, by switching to the massing graph view with F1, that the plane is centered in its wall. Now, this is a situation where negative centered and positive offsets, these ones, don't cut the mustard. We don't want this kind of alignment because here my 9 foot distance is from face of waterproofing to face of waterproofing. We want a slightly more custom location where the interface between studs and sheathing is right on the plane. For that, we're going to have to go custom. So our offset is going to change to a custom offset, and we're going to start finding the negative offset we're looking for. I happen to know that this assembly is symmetrical, 1/2 inch chip, and total of 1/2 inch of material out here, and the studs are 3.5 inches deep. So 1 and 3/4, is the distance to this line, and we want to go inboard. So I'm going to type -1 space 3/4 inches, and look at that, my math was right. This plane is aligned to the interface between studs and sheathing. So this has become the magic number for my assembly above grade. I'm going to reuse it across all the rest of the assemblies in just a moment. And I now want to actually address the below grade stem wall. So this assembly wants its waterproofing to align with the waterproofing above, and probably for the sheathing and the studs to both be supported by concrete. So here we're going to get a different custom offset because, once again, if I nudge this inboard, it's not quite what we're looking for. So we want an offset that is like 1/2 inch less than this. So I'm actually going to go custom again, and I'm going to go, this is a 6 inch wall plus a tiny bit. So if I went -3 inches, that is tantamount to having pushed it inboard. I want to now reduce that number by 1/2 inch. I'm going to go 2.5 inches. And now we're so close, it turns out that we are half of the waterproofing thickness offset. So funnily enough, this is 32/64. We're going to go -33/64. When you're dealing with very precise layers, very precise math is also required, and this kind of brief guessing game is something you do one time per assembly. After you find the right number, you can reuse it throughout your project. And we're also working on ways that offsets are going to be pickable, that you can choose one layer and choose the next layer and have them align. For now, finding the right number is a simple game of just understanding which direction is positive and negative, adding up your layers, and sometimes a little bit of guess and check. So we have our magic numbers for the above and below grade waterproof walls, I think the same number can be used for the below grade stem wall. And it's going to push the center line of this concrete to match the center line of the concrete just above it. So here now we have a bit of concrete below the stem wall, and I think we have 3 numbers that we can use for these 3 assembly types. For that now, I no longer need this cut plane. I'm now going to select the other above grade walls, and I'm going to apply a custom offset of -1 3/4. Boom. Now from stud to stud, my dimensions are 9 by 12. Similarly, I'm going to go to this wall down here, grab its funny custom offset, and grab the remaining stem walls. And I'm going to change these offsets to the same value. When I paste it, look at that, our waterproofing is now flush above and below grade. And I could use the same value for these 3 spread footings because we want to use the same funny number, -2 and 33/64. Now no matter which direction I cut, I could use the cut plane tool and cut this way, for example. We're going to find that the line work of the waterproofing and the location of the stud framing is right on the plane. Everything's looking great, although I do notice there's one more problem with the way that my assemblies meet one another, and that is actually the detail at the junction is kind of colliding here. We should fix this. We're going to do it by demonstrating the process of miter priority here. So I'm moving fast and I'm using some hotkeys like F1 and F2 to switch between view modes, and the CP hotkey to get back to my cut plane. But since I've talked about them once, I'm just showing you how we keep rolling with them in a nice fast cadence. The problems with this assembly appear to be that we have the same layer 6-inch cast-in-place concrete slab here and here. And Modumate uses a system called what we call miter priority to figure out what layers should enter into an intersection sooner than the others. This area here we call a miter. There's miters at every junction in the massing graph where planes meet. So here is a miter location where spread footing meets stem wall. Here's a miter location for the floor as a slab edge. Here's a miter location, etc. And anytime an edge gets cut by a cut plane and has many planes around it, their assemblies come together at a miter. Now miter priority is a scheme in the presets. I'm going to grab this floor here, jump into its preset by double-clicking on its name or picture in the properties tray. It brings up the BIM designer, and I see here the 6-inch cast-in-place concrete layer has a priority of structure 1. Well, that's all well and good, but down here in the stem wall, the same layer is found. This does not have a lower priority. It probably deserves a lower priority so that this stem wall will stop below the slab. It is all poured the same concrete, but for the line work to not overlap, we can have some different priorities here. So what I'm going to do actually is duplicate this layer. I'm going to name this shed stem wall layer, or concrete I'll call it. And I'll make this structure be structure 2. The way this miter group and priority properties work is that the miter group is a list of categories that layers can play, and the higher in the list the category is, the more important it is. So structures miter first, then substrates, then insulations, etc. Concrete is structural, it's a good category. The second round of the properties is the miter priority number, which is a ranking system where 1 is best and higher numbers indicate worse rank. So it's like a leaderboard. Number 1 is the top of the charts, and to have a higher number means worse rank. If I make this structure 2, for example, then look at that. We just taught these layers that the concrete, we see here that the concrete of the floor plate is now traveling right through on top of the concrete. It's superseding all else. It also has become so prominent that the waterproofing is no longer extending over its face, which is probably all right. We can fix that with one last layer of data. But because we fixed the miter priority at the preset level, we taught the floor plate we taught the stem wall to be less important than the floor plate. It just automatically happened everywhere in our model. We see that the floor plate has now superseded the stem wall on all 4 sides of the building with one little parametric change. Lastly, to make that waterproofing now lap over the floor correctly, we're going to do touch a custom detail here. I'll click back to project, and we're going to actually now use the most nuanced tool in all of Modumate's 3D modeling design tools, which is the edge detail tool. We're going to switch to the massing graph view, grab the edge. We notice that it has a property called detail on it. And most architects know that a construction detail is really like the junction between assemblies. That's what this edge represents. It's the junction between a wall, a stem wall, and a floor plate. So this edge is the site of a construction detail. We're going to customize it by adding a new custom detail and clicking edit. So when I click edit, I see the detail designer appear, and there's a matrix of values here. 3 assemblies: the exterior wall, the stem wall, and the concrete slab. We've got within each assembly a list of layers and their front and back extensions. In this case, we see zeros throughout for the shed exterior wall. These numbers mean how far up to the green line does my layer extend. In this case, the shed exterior wall says right up to the green line, and that's it. And what we want to do is extend this waterproofing layer 6 more inches. So for the waterproofing, we'll type an extension of 6 inches, and now we have the right extension. I think you probably saw the line work right there. If I switch to the physical view mode, we will also see that, I'll press F2 there, we see that the waterproofing has been extended over the concrete here. So we have the right area of waterproofing again. It's only happened on this one edge though. And so what we actually want to have happen is that this detail gets promoted to a typical condition. And what that means is whenever these 3 assemblies meet with the same offsets as they currently have, and the same relative angles, 90 degrees and 90 degrees, the Modumate system will prefer the detail I just designed over its default outcomes. When I click this magic box right here, is typical checkbox, now every time these 3 assemblies come together, it will by default extend the waterproofing. So this is a simple example, but if we had some kind of complex layers of awnings and roofs and ceilings, and we wanted to customize all the extensions there, saving it as a typical detail is a huge time saver when applying across. Large buildings can have as many as 70 or 80 edges with the same detail on them, and it automatically applies it for you. I'm going to call this floor slab edge. All right, and from here, I think the massing graph is now well laid out. We are ready to start decorating the interiors. All right, from here, we are going to add some surface graphs and finishes around the outside of this building. One of the things we're going to do is jump into our finish tool and add some exterior cladding to this building. So how about Modumate's finish tool has several out-of-the-box finishes. I think this is a pretty typical shed, so we're just going to use some unassuming fiber cement siding, and we're going to click on the face of these 4 walls, and as we do, we see that the finish just gets applied right away. We could go in and customize the color and the size of these boards later, but for now I'm just going to make sure that every surface gets the finishes I'm looking for. So this roof, we see some asphalt shingles are out of the box, pretty common roofing for something like a shed. So I'm actually just going to come up and decorate the surfaces of every assembly. You can see here that separators like walls, floors, roofs, and ceilings, every side of them can be decorated by a surface, by a finish like this. So on the sides of this roof and on the underside, I'm thinking maybe a paint would be more useful. So I'm going to go and grab some white paint. I'm not thinking white paint. How about I'll make a custom soffit paint? I'm going to duplicate this paint, double click. I'm going to call this soffit paint. And I'm going to also duplicate this layer and call it the soffit paint layer. Otherwise, the gray paint would get overridden by the changes I make to this layer. And I'm going to change the color tint to maybe some kind of like a lightish brown, like a lightish grayish brown, just to go with the warmth of the asphalt shingles above. So I'm going to go with some kind of maybe a color like this. When I hover underneath this awning and I click, I end up seeing that we've got here some nice kind of warm gray paint. I can tint it later if I don't like that color in the end. The clapboard is a little bit on the cool side, so maybe I'll warm up the clapboard as well. But what I also want to do is make like a fascia paint. So I'm going to go back to project, I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to jump into that one and call this fascia paint. And once again, duplicate the layer, call this fascia paint layer. And we're going to change the color here to be real dark. How about like a 222222, which is computer speak for a very darkish gray color, almost black color. And now I'm going to hover over the scene. I'm going to click on the edges of the roof plate, the roof slab, and we'll decorate it this way too. You know, we could add some kind of actual barge rafters or other extrusions like that, but I think that just painting the edges is kind of nice. It's a little bit too harsh, so I think what I'm going to do is actually come back here and change the color. As I pick new colors, you can see that I'm changing the model in real time, but what I want to do is pick a very kind of neutral color. Maybe I'll put it in the warm browns again, but kind of pick a slightly lighter brown. Maybe something like this. That's a little too... and that seems pretty good. It's more of a, you know, it doesn't catch too much attention. And so that's the finishes for the exterior of the building. We've put finishes on every surface. And if we once again hide the roof by selecting and hiding the roof, I'm not using select tool, sorry. So pressing escape to select tool and selecting the roof, HI for hide, we now see the interiors. And I'm thinking that we might want some white paint, maybe one accent wall. Maybe the back wall is an accent wall. I'm gonna press FI once again, and I'm gonna, I'll use the white paint that comes out of the box for 3 of my 4 walls. And then I'm gonna want a custom paint, maybe the accent wall paint. Duplicate this preset, double click in, duplicate, click on this, and we now have, I'm gonna name these things accent paint and accent paint layer. All right, so in terms of the color though, I'm thinking maybe some kind of like a lightish blue, maybe some kind of a medium blue like this could be nice. Yeah, it seems like it's going to be kind of nice and spunky for a small space to stay playful. On the floor of the space, I'm now also going to go back to my finish tool and grab one of our out-of-the-box floors, maybe like engineered bamboo wood planks. This is, pretty nice finish, but if it's going to be an office, then perhaps clicking this is the right, it's a good level of, realism. I kind of don't like this light colored gap though, so I'm going to jump in, I'm going to click once on it, double click its preset, and take a look at the top layer here, which has in its gap material a mortar material. That's not super accurate, but more importantly, I just want it to be dark. So I'm gonna actually jump in and grab a darker gap material that helps the space between boards read nicely. Looking really good there. I could change the species of wood on the boards if I wanted to by jumping back in and clicking on this engineered bamboo wood plank. If I wanted the surface material to be not bamboo, but maybe something more like, travertine. It's gonna be a big change. I could switch between hundreds of materials by clicking swap on the surface material. There's a whole wood section here, like Ipe, which is really often used for exteriors for its resilience. But in this case, I'm going to stick with the bamboo. So I'm going to go back to bamboo, pick bamboo. Seems like a really nice interior, soft wood type, even if it's just veneer. And the finishes have mostly been laid out. I do notice that I see a bit of exposed studs around the door frame because when we inset our walls, we didn't inset the windows and doors too. So I'm going to actually nudge this inboard with the letter A, and it's a little too far it seems. So I'm actually going to go custom here, and I'll set this to negative 1.75 inches again, just like the windows and doors, just like the wall rather. So I'll go to my custom offset, 1.75, negative 1.75 that is. And now it's kind of also set well into the wall. And it looks like when I changed my door, it did change the area where my surface graphs can live. So I'm going to go back to my finish tool and add the engineered bamboo back in. That demonstrates a particular lesson of Modumate that it's really great to get all of your assemblies offset the right ways, because if the amount of area that your surface graph can fill changes, it sometimes can't remember exactly. I used to be 4 points. Suddenly when my door changes position, I am now able to be 6 points, but I don't know how to add that different geometry, so I'm going to fall off and let the user re-add it. So if you find yourself adding finishes before you've finished your offsets and your massing graph, the changes to your offsets and massing graph may cause your finishes to fall off. But here I think I'm now truly done with my offsets of my massing graph and my separators. So I'm going to leave my surface graphs in. I'm going to add some furniture next. So let's jump into the furniture tool and get this space all decorated. Furniture tool. So we are now looking at some furniture here. I think as an office it needs a table. So I'm going to search table here, and we see, maybe desk is the right word. No, this keyword seems to have brought it up for me. I'm thinking this desk could look nice. In fact, it's got a nice kind of cool tone alongside that accent wall. It's got, it comes into the scene like this, and once you select it, you can use the rotate tool here. Hotkey is RO, and then you can click a point around which to rotate, a starting direction, and then an ending direction, or type an angle. In this case, I just rotated this desk to live kind of against the wall of the office. I'm going to move it up against the wall, and onto it, I think I'll put a computer. So again, hotkey FF to get into the furniture tool, and I'll search computer. How about this laptop right here? Seems pretty good. I will rotate this almost 90 degrees. I'm thinking like 84 degrees, just so it kind of has that slightly lived-in natural angle to it. And then how about this? I'm going to decorate the table with something else on the side next to it. So FF to the furniture tool, decoration. How How about we put in this decoration? Yeah, that's a place setting. We don't need that. Some books. That seems pretty nice. I'm going to do that. I'm going to rotate these books and turn them around like this. I'm also going to add a plant, just because I think plants are, you know, nice for a desk. So I'm going to search the word plant, and I see decorative plants here. For example, this potted plant's a little big, so I'm going to go with this little shrub right here. Looks pretty good. Now, I also need a chair, of course, so FF to the furniture tool, chair, and we see a variety of chair types. One of them is a task chair, like a desk chair. That seems good, but I think I like the white one in our library a little more. It goes with this kind of light and airy aesthetic for the room we're developing. I'm going to rotate it into place with, again, 84 degrees, sure. I don't know why I like the word number 84. It's just something that kind of has a nice little skew to it. And then on either side of this desk, how about we have some side tables? FF table. And I see here the side tables. This one seems like it's going to be a good size for either corner, and they kind of help add a little bit of functional storage to the room. And I can rotate this item by turning it 90 degrees, 90, enter, and then use the move tool to kind of push it over just a little bit. Looking good. There could be some side lamps on those tables, so I'm going to go FF lamp, and table lamps is a category. So I'm going to actually grab a lamp like this one, and maybe those are some lamps that can live in the room. Maybe that's a little too much lighting. It should be fine. No, actually, we're going to have just one lamp. Finally, there's a bit of extra space against the back wall, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to grab a chair. How about a lounge chair, accent chair? That's kind of nice. Is there space for this kind of chair? Yeah, this seems like it kind of goes with the rest of the sleekish aesthetic. So I'm going to rotate this into the corner of the room. I'm going to maybe set up a small side table for it. It's back into the furniture tool. The chair is climbing the wall. I'll search the word table. I see some tables here. How about this little occasional table? It's a little dark for the space. I wonder if there's an occasional table that's a little lighter. If I scroll over around here, side table here, this looks pretty good. How about that? And you know what? I'm going to make a second plant. This lets me demonstrate the Create Similar tool. When you select any element in Modumate, whether it's a wall, or it's a finish, or it's a piece of furniture, and you type CS, you can then create more of the same piece of furniture. Lastly, I think these walls need a bit of decoration, so I'm going to jump in one more time and search Art, and there's some artwork available here. How about we put kind of a nice big, maybe that's too big, maybe one of these pieces of art above the work desk. And then if I come up to the opposite side of the room, how about we put maybe one of the more geometric piece on this wall? It's a little bright, but it kind of adds some spark to the room. I think this seems nice. So we've now added two pieces of artwork. I don't know if we ever painted the underside of the ceiling, so I should unhide the ceiling. I'm now going to look at the ceiling, and we see here that there is some exposed wood. So I'm going to click on the paint here, and I'm going to press CS, Create Similar, to add white paint to the ceiling. If I'm trying to work on interiors of spaces, the camera angle by default is a little bit too narrow, but field of view is available in the camera properties, and you can type 110 degrees or something like that to greatly widen the field of view and allow you to navigate interior spaces much better. Great, all right. So we have made ourselves a shed. It's got some structure to it. It's got a full set of decoration. When I'm outside the building, 110 degrees is a little bit of a wide camera angle. So I'll go back to my 50. And yeah, so we've now completed the main part of the structure. As for our next step, I think we're going to add some terrain around the perimeter and some trees, and then we'll create some images of this final design that we could show a client. To lay out the terrain for this design, we're going to go into the terrain tool here, terrain graph. And the way the terrain graph tool works is that you can lay out a horizontal graph where your terrain will live. It's like a topographic map that is guaranteed to be flat. It's got blue edges. You'll see it come out right about now. Here I'm going to draw a nice simple rectangle, but if you have a parcel that has an unusual shape, feel free to draw its perimeter. In this shed's case, it's just going to live amidst a nice flat terrain. And as I complete that first face, we see a ghostly terrain floating above a blue and white graph. So this blue and white graph has two types of information that are given to a mesh that floats above it, which we see in ghostly form here, and which we can toggle between using the terrain graph tool when I go to the terrain graph tool here and we click on this terrain, we can turn it between the graph view mode and the terrain view mode. But of course this terrain does not look like what we want so far, so we're going to go back to the graph and change a few properties about it. The first thing is going to be the material. So here, this face actually currently says asphalt. The way that the terrain graph works is that the faces teach the terrain above them what material to be, and the vertices teach the terrain above them what height to be. So here we've got the heights of this terrain are all currently showing a height of 1 foot. And I think we want the terrain to be 0 feet by default. We might introduce a bit of slope to the site somewhere else, but I'm going to make this be a height of 0. And now the mesh is exactly in the same place as the graph face, about 4 inches below our building, as we've modeled before. And the next change we're going to make is the material is not going to be asphalt, but instead maybe something like moss. If we go back to our terrain and we go back to the terrain graph tool, we select the terrain and we make it X-ray view, we're going to see that the material has changed from asphalt to this kind of peaty ground cover that we might call moss. So this material here is also now flat. It's no longer a foot above the terrain graph. It's right at the terrain graph. And the next step is going to be adding a little bit of height to this terrain. So we're going to turn it back to its graph view mode. And the way that we control height is by touching these vertices and changing the value inside them. For example, I could make this backyard have a height of 3 feet. And when I do, that particular point is now teaching the terrain to be 3 feet above it. The other points are all still saying 0. Perhaps this point says -1, -1 foot. Now we're starting to see as if this shed lived somewhere along the backyard, a sloped backyard that's sloping from northeast down to southwest. And the difference though is that, or one of the consequences of that is that the terrain is no longer meeting the concrete where we wanted it to. This stoop is now floating, and the terrain itself is colliding with the cladding of the building. We would probably want to grade this area so that it still is flat at the pad. And the way we do that is by adding more points to our terrain graph. You can make as many points as you want in the terrain graph. Typically, we advocate for users to make only as many as you need to describe the terrain. So here we're going to have one. I just drew a line over to this point on the perimeter. I'm also now going to branch over and start clicking on the corners of my building, this L-shaped total concrete pad. And because the terrain graph is guaranteed to be flat, I can actually target points up in space, such as this edge right here, and when I click, it projects my clicks downward to the floor. So I'm now going to come over, I'm going to hold shift and just snap over here. I'm going to come over here and hold shift and snap here. I'm going to come this way and hold shift and snap here. And then I will hold shift and snap here. I like to hold shift just to make sure I'm drawing truly right-angled edges along the red and green axes. It makes things a little bit more clean and predictable. So what I've done though is I've added a series of vertices around the building, and each of these vertices gives us fresh control over the height of the terrain. I'm kind of like pinning the terrain's height at the building. So here we have a series of little blue points. I'm holding shift to add them all to my selection, and then as I click each one, looks like I have that one already, I should be able to type 0 for all of these points, and when I do, the terrain is now passing through at the building. It is sloping down until it passes right through this point and this point, this point, this point. They're all 0. There's one point over here that's still saying 1, so maybe I'll make this be 0 as well, because it's likely that we will be grading the area in front of the shed as well. So for that reason, I'm actually going to go to my terrain tool. I'm going to add an extra point here. Actually, it's here, but I'm holding shift along the red axis. I'm clicking over here, and the result was that I added a point here, which I'm also going to make be 0. So with all that done, and I think I can delete this point now, this line now, we have 2 faces in our terrain graph, the first of which surrounds the building and carries the terrain material of asphalt. Let's change it to moss. The second face in this terrain graph is an L-shaped face that we drew underneath the building. And I'm going to hide this concrete, HI to hide it. And then when I click here, we see that we have another terrain face selected whose property says terrain material. That says moss as well. We're going to change that to say empty hole. So this is a pretty important step that causes the building pad to be carved out and no terrain mesh to be generated inside it. So now we have an empty hole, and I can now unhide the concrete slab, and I can toggle between the graph and physical view modes Now that I've pinned the terrain to be flat at the building, I want to demonstrate that effect by making the heights around it a little bit more intense. So I've now raised this corner of the site to be 1 foot, lowered this to be -1 foot, I'll raise this to be 2 feet, and I'm going to raise this to be 5 feet, let's say. 5 feet. So we can see now that Modumate is always blending the heights of the points that you've put in into one big smooth terrain. If I wanted there to be some kind of a mound in the yard, all I would need to do is draw terrain lines out to that area and use points to pin down that this is going to be 5 feet, this will be 4 feet, etc. If I had a topographic map, I could import it as a background image and trace the line work in it, but I don't recommend tracing every single line in a topographic map if you have, for example, 1 foot spacing, 1 foot height demarcations. That's too many points. Modumate does the blending for you, so I advocate for tracing maybe only the 5 foot demarcations, and only in areas where the slope is not uniform. If the spacing between lines is pretty consistent, then it seems like Modumate's going to do the right terrain for you with very few points of input. If the terrain is frequently, the topo lines are getting close together and far apart, that indicates steep and flat transitions that more points would be suitable to model. So all that said, we are now going to go back to our terrain graph here. We're going to click on it. We're going to switch it back to X-ray view, and we can see that now this shed is part of a larger sloped site. We're going to add some trees to this site now, back in the furniture tool. So FF&E currently includes our trees because all of the different decorative elements are in this tool. And when you search the word tree, you'll find a little more than a dozen trees available in Modumate. You can grab these trees and place them in the scene, and perhaps we want something like this tree, for example, could be in front of the window here, might cast some nice shadow into the main space. Let's go and add a tree like this into the back. Let's go and add tree number 11, I think is a little larger. Yeah, so this here will be in the backyard. And I think here we're getting pretty close to a complete scene. There are a few other colors of trees too, so maybe we add that. And this one's a little in the way, so I'm gonna actually move it slightly out of the way of the main view. Great, we're starting to get a nicely decorated scene. Some of the things that we can do when it comes to presenting this for the client is to switch to the view mode called physical view mode here, which is gonna hide any leftover graph elements visible in scene. Based on our previous view, there were actually some light gray dots here I found at the corners of the windows, which the physical view mode hides. So we get an entirely physical view. And then we also can turn on and off the world axes to remove the bright colored lines from the scene. And we can save this view in our 3D views list, so that in the camera drop down there's a views list, which includes cut planes that we were making before for things like plans and sections. Let's make a few of those right now. So a new cut plane tool, let's cut a cut plane roughly at here, and also cut a section right about here. And so these two cuts will be known as our, if I select one, I'll call this the floor plan. And if I select this one, I will call it the east-west section. And these will both, I can call it with either one. And here you can see that we've cut the model open. We can see the interior. If I turn off culling for that cut plane and instead turn on culling for this cut plane, we'll see the interior more like a dollhouse. So we can raise this if we want. I'll use the move tool MV to raise this cut plane up to just below the height of the roof. So we can kind of look inside a little more like a dollhouse. And then because the line work tends to superimpose, we can go back to our views list here and turn off the cut planes we don't want to see. So you can have the culling cut plane on, and then you can turn off the culling and hide it. And these cut planes will be reusable for you in the future. You just gotta come back to your views list and turn them on either in their culling and or their line work. So that now we have a couple of cut planes for future use. The next thing we can do is create some saved 3D views. So once again in this add new views item here, you can click new 3D view, and then this item here, you can double click to change its name to overall exterior view. And it's going to save the time of day, the field of view, the camera position. It lets me orbit somewhere else and then click overall exterior view to come right back to the, oop, I apologize, I think I accidentally overwrote it. I'll want to update this view here. And then I'll come over from here, I'll click on overall exterior view, and it pops me right back to the place where I had just saved it and updated it. Similarly, I think it's going to be nice for us to have an interior view of this space because it is kind of a nice, it has a good vibe to it, but the field of view is a little bit too narrow, so we're going to make this more like 120, which is pretty dramatic, but I think it works. So here I'm actually just gonna scroll my wheel here and scoot my camera over. I'm orbiting, panning, and zooming subtly into space to get a good view of the space. And this looks like a decent view to understand the room. It's a little bit wonky, like the perspective warp is a little strong, but I think it's easy to read the space. So I'm now gonna save this as my interior view. New 3D view, double click, overall interior view. And I think I'm just also gonna click update just as a superstition. And now I have two views when I click on them, overall exterior view, overall interior view. And we could even make a top-down view that has a section up for a dollhouse view if we wanted. But these are two render views that we can show to our clients. It's also worth pointing out that these render views can be used alongside a tool called ray tracing if your hardware supports it. So if you have a computer with a dedicated gaming graphics card that can compute ray tracing, it's a lot of computation per pixel, but when you turn it on, it's going to end up turning the lighting in Modumate much more realistic. So here you can change the time of day, for example, to something that's going to cast the shadows into the space, maybe through the tree. Is that possible to have happen? I think so. If we go to a month of the year that's a little bit, yeah, something like this, for example, is now the lower sun angle is casting the shadow right through the tree. You can obviously still do your modeling. This is a view of Modumate that just improves the graphics quality and is really useful for the final presentations, for making still images and so forth. It's a little bit lower frame rate when you're modeling with ray tracing, but overall, still, I think adds a lot of polish compared to the clean and clear and easy to read, but not as realistic interior views with the default graphics. It's also worth pointing out that when you use ray tracing in the exteriors, sometimes it's a little bit bright. And so the exposure slider over here allows you to compensate for the brightness and turn up and down the amount of brightness that you actually see. We're actually also expanding the brightness in just a couple of weeks. We've heard feedback that this is still a little bright, so we're going to be lowering the minimum exposure available as well. But when you switch between views, it may be the case that your exposure wants to get readjusted. So all in all, I think what we've just accomplished is a complete shed design, front to back, start to finish, with from a blank scene to a complete design like this that can be shown off to a client so you can get some approvals to start building them that backyard shed or whatever size project you're looking after. The training like this one is actually covered in greater detail for larger projects as a part of our standard plan. If you ever feel the need to work on this kind of training and you want to see it applied to your very own project, well, the Modumate standard plan comes with consultative advice from our licensed architect trainers such as myself. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out, and as that part of that standard plan, we are going to be consulting you every step of the way to a successful first Modumate project. But hopefully, the lessons you learned here between modeling your massing graph, crafting, hosting, offsetting, and detailing your separators, applying your finishes and furniture and attachments, making your terrain, and setting up your final 3D views, as well as your cut planes, which form the basis for your DWG exports to AutoCAD, is a productive and useful set of learnings and deliverables for you in your practice. Please look around for additional videos that are going to be coming out in the near future. We're going to be starting a whole series, and I think that this is just the beginning, but we'll be covering every nook and cranny of a building, from its dormers to its decks to its kitchens and bathrooms. And if you have any requests for the next training you'd like to see, place a comment down below, and we'll make sure to comment back and address you and give you an estimate on when in the timeline we'll end up addressing that kind of training. But we always want to film the content that you want to see, so give us that kind of advice, recommendations, requests, and like and subscribe to the channel if you want to make sure you're alerted to more trainings, especially if you're trying to get off the ground with Modumate. Or if you really want that maximum help, become a standard plan customer and we will be helping you on your very own projects. Until next time, my name's Richmond with the Modumate training team. This has been a Modumate tutorial. Hope you enjoy your modeling.